Muito obrigada, Sr. Presidente. Passamos então ao primeiro momento Keynote do nosso simpósio, pelo que chama ao palco Ana Ciaunica, do Centro de Filosofia das Ciências da Universidade de Lisboa, que irá centrar a sua intervenção no tema Inteligência Artificial e Filosofia.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me now? Yes. First of all, I would like to apologize for not speaking in Portuguese. I understand Portuguese very well, but my Portuguese is very bad when I speak. So I said I'm not going to inflict you on a very early morning my Portuguese, so I apologize for speaking in English. And I also want to thank the organizer for inviting me here. It's a really great pleasure to be here. So I'm going to start with a bit of the background. So my background is in philosophy. So I was trained as an armchair philosopher, an analytic philosophy. And I did my thesis in France, I'm French, from University of Burgundy. And my main question was like, how can we connect mental states, like conscious states, with brain states, like the physicalism and qualia? So that was the big question, the big mystery of consciousness, so to speak. And I know that at the first sight, this like looks a bit disconnected from the theme of artificial intelligence that we have right now. But I want to convince you that actually there is a deep connection there between the philosophy of mind and embodiment and what is happening today with artificial intelligence. I think it's important, and this is why I'm so grateful that in a field where we talk about artificial intelligence, we also have philosophers, because philosophers that allows us to, philosophy allows us to actually take a step back and look at the big picture and to understand everything and not to get lost, not see the forest because of the trees, yeah? So this is what I'm going to do in this talk, a bit like stepping back a bit and trying to zoom in slowly towards like the why it's so important to look at artificial intelligence topic from a philosophical perspective as well. So, as I said, so my training was in philosophy of mind and analytical philosophy, but I also, I did my first postdoc in Switzerland, I also took a master and courses in cognitive neuroscience, because I wanted to understand not only from a theory perspective, but actually how things are working in the real world, right? So that was really, really important for me. So I'm basically a philosopher that also does science on this. So here is my roadmap. As I said, I'm going to talk about the mind-body problem. Can you hear me if I speak like this? Because I like to see the screen. And I'm going to say what is the connection. I want to show that basically there is a connection between the classical philosophy mind-body problem and what we call right now, I would like to call right now, the artificial mind and artificial body problems. I think there is a continuity there. And then I'm going to speak about a bit about what we call the embodied computation, which is potentially a link between the two. And I'm going to end with some implication and the future project that I'm currently implementing in Lisbon on artificial agents. So, as I said, I'm going to start with the with the background. So bear with me on the slides. It's a funny slide. You'll see later why. Because you probably all did a PhD or you're about to do, and you know how hard work is to actually just go through the thesis and everything else. And towards the end, I was like talking with my friends. I was like, I'm really fed up with this problem, the mind-body problem. I really want to finish this and do something else. And one of my friends is actually an artist, and he said, okay, so I'm going to put in one slide, can you put in one slide, the main topic and the main question, the main, problem of your thesis? And I asked him to do this, and sorry, up. This is the slide. So So a bit of the background. So why do we have the mind-body problem in the first place? So that was my question, right? So what's so special about the split in the first place? And then we realized that we have this like idea that we have basically two realms. One is the realm of abstract, immortal, and one is the realm of like ephemeral bodily stuff, because we know that we're going to give birth and then we're going to die, and we see our body decaying, but there is something which is over and above this kind of like perishable stuff, physical stuff, and that somehow must be the mind. And actually that comes from very early on in philosophy and history of ideas, and they even had this like pictures called the Soma Sema picture, and it's a beautiful metaphor, because Sema in Greek means tomb, right? So the body is a tomb for the soul. So there is this very powerful connection that somehow disappears when somebody dies, right? So you have the immaterial soul and the immaterial body. So there's some like two different realms. And okay, so this, as I said, this is like a very, I'm going to give you like the big picture, because I think this is important and you'll see why later. But then the question is how you do actually connect the two, because you obviously somehow connected, right? So how exactly this is happening in the real world, right? So even if we have these two realms, somehow in humans, in us, things are intertwined, and this is the famous mind-body problem. So how exactly these mental states connect with this like physical stuff that eventually will disappear? So Aristotle does not question the existence of the Platonic soul-body dichotomy, but unlike Plato, he feels the need to define empirically. He wants to know what is like the visible connection between those two separate entities, whose union, almost impossible from a metaphysical point of view, forms one of the deepest mysteries of the universe. And the process of cognition will have to be analyzed in connection with the subtle physiology of the apparatus which serve as intermediary between the body and soul. So Aristotle was one of those who actually was doing like some empirical research of what exactly is happening in the body in order to these two things to be connected. And then we move forward in the history of philosophy. I'm giving a very brief apologies for the overview. It's really brief, but for the sake of time. So this is something that actually we inherited in our way of looking at the problem through that distinction. And we inherited the following main points, which is we call the Cartesian heritage, which is the mind is an inner realm connecting to the outside world via the senses, to which only the eye has privileged access, about which has incorrigible knowledge, and the self forms the self-evident starting point of an entire philosophical system. That's the Cartesian, cogito. And the mind is a different sort of the entity from the body, so much that it does not depend on the existence of the body for the functioning. And the mind can, in fact, grasp the nature of the reality so far more easily when it is not encumbered by its attachment to anything corporeal. So that's just like the set of tacit assumptions that we somehow inherited from this way of framing the connection between our mind and body. So as I said, we have this like dichotomy between the mind and body and the material and immaterial system. Yeah, so that's the summary up to now. Okay, so why I gave you all this like feed forward, fast forward background, and how is this connected with the artificial intelligence, and why is this important? Why is it not just like, well, this, philosophers wondering about how the mind connects with the body? Yeah, I think it's important because actually this distinction very much still permeates our society. I'm going to give you two examples. I'm going to focus on the second one because it's the topic of our symposium. So the first example is the following. So if you have a mental health problem, you go to a different building. If I have a liver problem, I go to a different building. So this means that even at the institutional level, the mind-body problem is so split. I mean, the mind-body are two entities that are so split that we even have like physically different buildings for different types of our identity as humans, right? So that's one important point. And the second one, which is related to the topic of the symposium today is the way we approach the things that we manufacture, we artifact, right? Yeah. So we have this idea that somehow we are able to, create or artifact artificial minds or intelligence, yeah? And on the other hand is like we try to manufacture artificial bodies, right? Like robots, whatever, yeah? And then obviously we're going to have again the problem. It's like, wait a minute, but how they disconnect together, right? So how can we put some intelligent system in a body, or the other way around? Can we have something hybrid and everything else? So I think that's one of the major problems that we may have with this type of approaches, because I think we have tacitly inherited some sort of distinction that I think is merely conceptual, but is not really implemented in the real world. It's coming from another way of actually looking at the reality. And this is something that I'm trying to push against in my projects, in my work. I'm saying, well, maybe that distinction between the pure mind and the impure body, that's the problem in the first place, yeah? So I'm a philosopher, but as I said, I also have training in cognitive neuroscience, and I'm doing my work collaboratively, interdisciplinarily. So I'm not doing everything by myself. This is something that I'm doing with a bunch of very talented people that work in different fields. And whatever I'm going to present you from now on is collaborative work that I'm doing with these people. So one question that one can ask is like, okay, so what is so special about the mind, right? So why there is like this drive to think that somehow the mind is different in kind from the body that is kind of like you see in the real world, right? So I think one of the basics, the basic answers, and the most obvious answer is that, you can get as many wrinkles in your body and you can eventually die, but then 2 + 2 always equal 4. So there is always something like doesn't move, doesn't, disappears. It's kind of like some sort of like fundamental stuff. So then the question is, maybe there is something in the functioning of the human brain and the human mind that actually it's similar to the 2 + 2 = 4, right? And that will give us something like a solid basis where we'll put the mind in a very different level than the disappearing body, yeah? So, for instance, like there are some theories that show that, called the global theories of neocortex, and they show that, they try to argue that in superficial complexity and functional diversity arise from very simple underlying principle in much the same way that the apparent complexity of planetary orbits emerge from simple and mathematically explicable physical law. So there will be like a simple underlying principle, and that will be like the same. And this might explain why we tend to look for something, a law that will explain universality in the human mind. And it might be a sort of like common underlying algorithm, canonical cortical computation of the neocortex. So the idea would be that, well, can we find a sort of like 2 + 2 = 4, but for the human mind, right? So if it's like for the human brain, because then if we find it, then maybe we have this like underlying bridge and the principle between the two, between the physical and the mental. And obviously, since we started to bring this mathematical approach to understanding mental states and the human mind and the human brain in general, and the obvious metaphor was that of a computer, because a computer, this is precisely what it's doing. It's like computing a processing algorithm and numbers. So so there is sort of analogy done, which is the famous one between the mind as a computer, and even in actually this permeates our daily life, because we say all of the time that we are programming myself, as like I'm multitasking. I'm running on different operating systems. So for instance, right now we are driving, in the car, and it's like some people are talking, some people are driving. So no, take the right, no, it's not one. So it's like multitasking. crashing, so we crash, yeah, and being rebooted, right? Sometimes it's like, I really need a break or a coffee because I feel like, and this is important because, you remember the slides that I saw before. It was more about, this immaterial stuff which is happening, which is more like a soul, whatever. But since the computational approach and the coming from the mathematical thinking, then it became more respectable, so to speak, to think in certain terms. So because this computational framework has rendered theorizing about the inner processes respectable, so you can put a number what is happening in that person's mind and the brain, and potentially even find whether that there is a law that is as universal as the laws of physics that actually rule the entire universe. Yeah. And also it's important because it provides a unified and naturalistic arena in which to conduct debates about psychological models, and provides the opportunity to accurately simulating and reproducing psychological processes. And this is a very useful tool because basically we can simulate agents in virtual environments and basically get answers on a scale that otherwise would be literally impossible to run experiments in the empirical world. So that's very useful as well. But nowadays, many people would say that the mind is in some sense like a computer. And how exactly is that? So as a philosophers, we like to actually, delve deeper and to zoom in. What do you mean by saying that the mind is a computer, in which sense, yeah? And there are obviously several views, yeah? Or like with several branches of, so I think the received view is that computation must involve representational content. So you represent something from the outside world into the system, and it is a necessary condition on any physical process counting as computation to process a representational content. And this is the famous approach by Churchland, Dennett, Fodor. So cognitive neuroscience explains the cognitive capacities of what is happening in the brain, the human mind, in terms of neural computation over neural representation, right? So you have like there's two layers. And the neural representation would be like literally the bridge from the reality to what is happening in the mind. So this is like the pineal gland, if you like, right, from the Descartes. And this explanation are so successful that mainstream cognitive psychology and cognitive science are being absorbed within cognitive neuroscience. So it's almost like everything what is happening in the brain. If you want to understand behavior, you really need to look at the brain as well. So the take-home message, or all this approach is like, okay, so now we have this received view that our brain is functioning as a computer. But some people disagree with the received view. Yeah. So, for instance, like people working on the ecological view says that, well, it's not enough to focus what is happening just in the head, because cognition is primarily explained in terms of dynamical variables characterizing the interaction between the agents and environment. So the idea here is that it's like, instead of looking at the mind, instead of looking at the body as some sort of vehicle designed to fuel and transport the mind, is that way around. Actually, the mind has evolved to subserve the biophysiological needs of the body in the environment. So it's a complete shift in the perspective, right? So the body comes first, the mind is serving the body, not the other way around. So people like Gibson say computation and representation are at best helpful glosses and at worst misleading metaphors. Other people at the opposite side will say, well, computation is processing of the medium-independent vehicle by a functional mechanism in accordance with the rule. So this is kind of like in between. A vehicle is a medium-independent just in case it is defined solely in terms of like manipulation with certain degrees of freedom. And also there is like the former mathematical view saying that computation must be understood purely in mathematical and syntactical terms. Yeah, so this is like coming from Marr theory. But Mark Spivak has a very nice paper 2010 against the position number 3. Yeah, and then we are getting closer to the work I'm doing right now. So obviously, in order to get cognition, in order to get understanding and computation in the world, from the world, representation from the world, we need somehow to perceive the world, right? It doesn't come from like, the thin air. So we need to basically have some inputs from the external world and our body to actually be able to process and compute over those signals. And then, again, the question is, because I'm a philosopher, I'm asking, okay, but what is the relationship between perception and cognition, right? So how we get from one to the other. So again, the receiver view, Fodor famously said that the relationship between perception and cognition is transparent, in a sense like the perceptor receives a function to interpret the traduced information and to make it available to the central processes, right? So it just basically take the information in. But then there are other people from other approaches, they disagree with that. They say, okay, so there is no the idea that actually perception is one system and then cognition is another system, and then there's something like a transparent pane of glass between separating border between the two, but actually we can see perception and cognition as on a spectrum, right? It's like it's on a continuum. So we have some sort of processing that starts with the perceptive processing and slowly going to the cognitive ones. And that's something like, for instance, like Chris Fried will argue and his colleague, they question the idea that perception and cognition constitute useful kinds from the perspective of cognitive neuroscience in the first place. So it's not a clear distinction between perception and cognition. And this gave this approach of like there is a continuum between perception and cognition gave rise to, let's say, a new influential approach of how to understand the mind, which basically try to strike the balance between the two views. And I think the best way to describe this is through a contrast or the metaphor. So the received view says that, okay, so your brain is some sort of like passive system, like a sponge absorbing information, and then something is going on in the system, and then, give rise to the motor outputs there in the world. So it's like you receive something operating and then, and then get it back into the world. So there is the new approach, the prediction processing approaches say, well, that might not be the case, because actually the brain is not a passive machine or a system, but it's actively predicting what is coming next on the basis of prior inputs. So I basically anticipate or expect the world or the next sensory input or the next information on the basis of whatever I have already experienced, perceived, and cognized before. And then I contrast my expectation against the received stimuli. And if it matches as much, if there is a mismatch, then I get what they call a prediction error. And the prediction error is sent back to the higher level of the system to update the model, such as actually you expect later on a different type of information. And there is by now, there is like a lot of empirical data going into this direction, say that indeed we do not perceive the world as it is veridically, but we perceive the world as we expect to be, based on our priors. And why I'm talking about this, because basically this is a view that is very much compatible with the ecological view that I told you before, and in the sense like the body and the survival of the body is really, really prior. It comes first. So cognitive systems and cognitive processes have evolved to basically make sure that we maintain our internal states like homeostatic balance within a certain range for survival. So for instance, like we survive here, but we might not survive in Antarctica because it's too cold for us, but some other creature, some other self-organizing biological system might survive there because they have a different way of actually processing the external information. So, and this means that actually we need to rethink the entire way of how we connect the mind-body through the lens of the fact that actually we are first and foremost biologically self-organized system that have a limited span of time and want to survive. Yeah. So this means, and how you do that, because the information coming from the outside is bigger than your head, right? It's like whatever is coming from the environment is almost like all the time unpredictable. So how you can predict something that by definition is like unpredictable? And the way the brain solves this problem is by constructing inner models of the self and the world and the relation between the self and the world, by extracting statistical patterns of information from its embodied and worldly interactions. Yeah. So the key idea here is that our ongoing perception, cognition, and action are processed through the lens of prior self and world-related information processing. And why is this important? Because this gives us a sort of like dynamic approach to how we understand how the mind and body connects with each other. Okay, and so when we started this, to think about all this approach, I said, wait a minute, we still have some work to do because there is little consensus of what exactly we mean by computation, yeah, and what this means for a physical system like the brain to implement a computation. What is exactly the broad brush computation architecture of the mind? That's something, again, an open question. And how do I assess the merits of computational model and which computational architecture we can rule out? Yeah, so which one are kind of like the best fit? And how does computational models actually relate to previous models, such as like the control theoretic models, statistical model, dynamical system theories? That's a very much an open question. But we in our project, we want to focus on the difficult part. We don't want to focus on what is the kind of like the static architecture or like let's say the simple unifying principle behind like the computing mind. We want to focus actually on the difficult part. We want to take risk, yeah. We're going to focus on the spooky, so to speak, as I said, so on the dynamic part. And we said, well, a physical state counts as computational only to the extent that it participates in physical computational process, right? This is something that is ongoing all the time. It makes no sense to posit a computational state in isolation from any computational process. So we take in this project, so this is the project we started in Lisbon at the Center for Philosophy of Science. So we are very grateful for the Foundation for Science and Technology because they funded our idea, which is highly interdisciplinary. So here we have an international team and an interdisciplinary team. So here we're going to look. Basically, we're going to contrast dyadic human-human versus human-artificial agents interactions, and we're going to have 3 types of artificial embodiments because we are interested in how exactly artificial bodies, impact the human bodies, and how exactly artificial minds impact the human minds. Why? Because we shouldn't consider this in isolation from each other. I mean, we saw it through the pandemic. It's like we cannot really survive alone. We really need the interaction, right? So the interaction is something that really constitutes our selfhood and our being in the world. So if we want to understand the mind, so that's our take, and artificial minds and body, we really need to look at the process of interaction between, how the humans interact with artificial agents and how artificial agents interact with each other. And this is what we're going to do. So we're going to have human-human contrast versus humanoid robots, virtual reality characters, and chats. And we're going to look at how this type of interactions basically are processed by the human brain. And we're going to have multi-methods approach. We're going to record what is happening in the body, like psychophysiological measures like heart rate, skin conductance, breathing, during this interaction. We're going to also measure behavioral responses. Are you quicker, slower? Why? What is your space, peripersonal space? What is your perception of time when you're doing this type of interaction? And then going higher up, we're going to look at the subjective level, how people feel about this. This is the phenomenology. And also we're going to record a neural state, so what is happening in the brain while people having this interaction. With human versus dyadic human artificial agent interaction. And we're going to use FNIS because FNIS gives you, it's more mobile, it gives you more ecological validity because we can set up like interactive settings. So I'm very excited because I'm a philosopher getting to do experiments, and now I have a lab. I can interact with the participants, and I invite you all to come to see me, and whether we can have collaboration as well, because I'm very much open to collaborate with people in Portugal and abroad. So we have in our team, I have Antonia Hamilton from Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience in London at UCL as co-PI, and then we have two philosophers, Sean Gallagher and Andy Clark, and two neuroscientists, Carl Friston and Guillaume Dumas, working on the interactive part. The project is just started, and basically, probably some of you already recognize the slide. This coming from the Blade Runner movie, yeah. So there is a difference. It's because this is the first step in understanding how exactly the human mind works and contrasting well, like the computer or the artificial mind. And then I'm building some collaboration with some biologists where we look whether we can talk of hybrid agents, in the sense like you have like half biology, half computation, and how is that connected with our received ontology about the world, yeah? So that's also something in progress. And also whether there is something special about being born versus being made. And this is a different, line of work that I'm doing. I'm working on embodiment, and I'm specifically also working in co-embodiment. I'm interested not necessarily how the mind relates to other mind, but I'm interested in also how the body relates with other bodies, and then starting already from utero. Because typically, when we think of pregnancy, we automatically associate it with a certain category of person that have the ability to carry babies in their bodies. But if you look through the perspective of a developing human, we all have shared our body with the body of another person. So that state of co-embodiment is universal, and I'd like to investigate that in my research as well. But that's a different line. It's somehow related because, as I said, I'm interested to see whether there's something special about being born versus being made. Yeah. And I'm going to end with an invitation. It's not 2022, it's 2023. Apologize for the topic, for the typo. So we plan to basically take this project a step forward in terms of like interdisciplinary collaboration, because up to now we kind of like staying within the academic environment, but we plan to actually take in outside academia and to collaborate with artists and performers to look at the relationship between embodiment, movement, and the relationship between artificial minds, artificial bodies, and humans. And this is something that we plan to do in collaboration, obviously, with the Centre for Philosophy of Science in Lisbon, the Network for Embodied Consciousness Technologies and Arts. I really like the acronym, NECTARS, yeah. I also have the logo, which is a flower with some bees, it's like going from one flower to another. And you are very much welcome to attend next year in October, yeah. And that's it from my side. I would like to thank the funder for giving me the opportunity to test these ideas empirically and to develop this line of work. And I would like to thank you for your attention. And as I said, I'm very much open to collaboration. So if you have any proposals or questions, please find me. I'd be very happy to be in touch with you. Thank you.
Se alguém tiver alguma questão para colocar, entretanto, podem aproveitar agora. Se não, convido-vos, obviamente, na pausa que teremos a seguir a esta primeira mesa redonda que se segue, a falarem e a comentarem. Acho que temos uma questão ali. Acho que é só. Mais uma... Professor Vítor, por favor. And I'm sorry, we are recording this. Do you mind? Thank you.
So I do have a position about that. So I think actually this is related with my latest paper, where the title is called "The Brain is Not Mental." So basically, here I argue that if you take the perspective not from neurons but perspective of the cells. So you take the neurons, a neuron is a cell, right? So how cells collaborate with each other, right? So how they implement it, then you see that actually you need to have the network of cells in place successfully before you have the network of neurons. And one of the first networks that you need to have in place to actually have successfully a brain developing is the immune system, right? So that's this immune system in the body gives you what is, we saw it with the pandemic, right? So what is me, what is not me, what is self, what is my body, what is not my body. So my take is quite radical on that. I'm saying that if you build something that you consider as like an artificial brain and put in like an artificial body, that will be a completely different system that actually the one we have right now. It's ontologically something very, very different. I'm not saying it's not possible, most probably going to be, but I think as a philosopher, I want to say it's a category mistake to actually slip from the intuition that we have from our perspective, or like, experiential perspective was what it's like to actually, have a body and, suffer and love and everything else, and then to extrapolate it to the machines, which are completely different constitutively. I think that's a questionable step, and I don't want to take the step. I'm not saying it's not possible. That actually there is a series. I don't know if you saw it. It's called Upload, which is basically exactly this. It's like in a future world, if you're rich, your family are forced to upload yourself, which is basically the head, in a virtual body in a paradise. So if you are rich, you get a nice paradise. If you're poor, you get a bad paradise. I mean, hell. But the idea is the same. So you have somehow the mind-body disconnected, but that's not, this is what I'm trying to do with my work, say that's problematic. It's coming from this like distinction that we had for very different reasons long time ago. But I think right now, if we really want to implement and to build artificial system, we need to get rid of that distinction. Otherwise, it's not going to work because they're not interacting with the environment, and we are built to interact with the environment.